as those power relationships change, the insurgency will simply come back. Now, I've seen this at first hand. In Afghanistan in 2001, the US-led coalition of dozens of international countries defeated the Taliban in less than 7 weeks. Key Taliban commanders, after the fall of Kandahar on the 7th of December 2001, signed a surrender document, laid down their weapons, went home, and tried to live in peace in southern Afghanistan. But we, the international community, failed to go through the necessary process of reconciliation, accountability, and building the basis for lasting peace. Those Taliban who'd been reconciled and attempted to go back home and live normal lives were subjected to abuse by various power brokers within the Afghan community until one by one they gradually fled across the frontier into Pakistan and formed or reformed the insurgency that we're fighting today. The Quetta Shura wasn't even formed. That's the leadership group of the Taliban. Wasn't even formed until October of 2003. So the fight that we are engaged in today in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Pakistani army dealing very heroically with its own internal threat from Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the international community on the other side of the border dealing with the Afghan Taliban, is in some ways a result of a failed reconciliation process where we didn't allow for a full and inclusive process of peace after the campaign of 2001. Another example that's closer to home for me is East Timor. In East Timor, the Australian-led intervention force succeeded again in cooperation with Indonesia in nipping an insurgency in the bud in 1999 and 2000 and crushed the militia who'd so violently attacked and abused the Timorese people and threatened to bring down the newly independent state. But again, the international community failed to conduct a fully transparent and accountable peace and reconciliation process. And we and the Timorese excluded some key players from the peace process. By 2002, there were already some signs of unrest. By 2006, there was again open violence in East Timor. Both these cases show to me that the failure to fully engage in the difficult and painful process of a fully accountable, transparent, peace-building and reconciliation process can simply lead to a resumption of the conflict. And that is independent of how effectively the military forces conduct their part of the operation. The actions that Sri Lanka has taken since the end of the conflict in May 2009, I think, are very impressive and very encouraging. As we've already talked about today, more than 280,000 internally displaced persons have been released or resettled. Over 30 high security zones have been demobilized, allowing over 3,000 families to return home. Development and reintegration programs also seem to be in full swing. The DDR program has made impressive progress, and the Joint Plan for Assistance to the Northern Province looks set to bring economic development and investment to Jaffna and the surrounding areas. But challenges still lie ahead. This is a long-term process. IDPs still require basic necessities and state services, and there are still 15,000 Tamils living in refugee camps. 70,000 refugees are still in Tamil Nadu. The resolution of that situation will have a huge impact on future reintegration processes. And again, there are many examples of the way that reintegration of refugees and displaced persons affects the conduct and the process of a peace process. The JPA focuses primarily on economic investment and on development for the North in an attempt to return to a state of normalcy. Economic development can be a key aspect of counterinsurgency. Indeed, it almost always is a key aspect of counterinsurgency. But in my experience, in 7 counterinsurgency campaigns, by itself, prosperity does very little to address the drivers of conflict. A return to normalcy is important for the health and safety of the Tamil population, but it was the normal condition of Tamils living in Sri Lanka that led in part to the rise of the Tigers in the first place. So if we want to repeat the conflict that we've just seen, going back to normal is a good way to do that. Reconciliation needs to go past what used to be normal to a new definition of normal that's more inclusive. Now, it's very easy to stand here and talk about political reconciliation, but of course carrying it out on the ground is extremely difficult and is a long drawn-out process. Paul Collier, who's a World Bank economist, has found that countries affected by conflict are much less likely to return to violence if they engage in an all-encompassing peace and reconciliation process. Countries that don't, more often than not, go back to civil war within 10 years. Unfortunately, the best practices for those kinds of processes can be unclear, and they need a very long-term investment of resources and effort. It's impossible to artificially accelerate the resolution of complex economic, social, and political problems. Given that context, I'd like to provide some thoughts on the ways in which governments can be effective in addressing the needs of their local population. One essential area in which we can help ensure long-term peace is the way in which the government carries out reconstruction and redevelopment. Redevelopment efforts that are executed from the bottom up with a strong focus on improving community-level resiliency have proven especially effective in the field, in many of the last several conflicts, in achieving long-term stability. And the design and execution of reform initiatives is as important as the content of peace-building measures. Just as the Sri Lankan Army underwent a grassroots bottom-up transformation of its operational strategy and its organizational culture in order to effectively defeat the Tigers and win the war, so we need to focus on the political and civilian or civil redevelopment of former insurgent areas. And we have to start with a bottom-up solution to governance reform, community resiliency, and sustainable security. Community-focused reintegration is especially effective in increasing the impact of DDR and redevelopment plans. There's a huge amount of evidence for that in the field research of the last decade or so. Institutionalization of governance at the local level to foster linkages between the government and communities is also vital. And I was particularly encouraged by what was said this morning about fully integrating and linking the economies of the North and South as a preventive measure to prevent the return to conflict. Finally, I'd argue that there needs to be some psychological rehabilitation. You're talking here about a population that's lived under a fall of intense terror and fear for an entire generation. That kind of fear and the psychological trauma that's involved in that doesn't just go away overnight. And it doesn't only affect individuals, it also affects the way a community deals with its own individuals within itself and the way it deals with other communities. So a form of psychological rehabilitation or psychological reconstruction needs to be part of an effective process. Now, I bring these points forward not because I think you're not doing them, but because I think that you are doing them. I think that the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission provides a model of some of the things that we've talked about here. Provided that the Commission honestly and openly examines the events that took place from the breakdown of the ceasefire agreement to the end of hostilities in May of 2009, looking at the causes of the conflict in detail and thinking about ways to move forward on reconciliation, it's got a huge amount of potential to move towards meaningful peace for the future. And I was particularly happy to hear the statement recently by the Minister for External Affairs, Professor Peres, who was here earlier today, affirming the government's commitment to work towards a genuine reconciliation plan, working with all parties on a compromised devolution package. Those kinds of political measures are very important. It's not for me as an outsider to say what's right or what's wrong in the specific decisions that Sri Lankans have to make about those questions. But the fact that Sri Lanka is thinking about them is very encouraging as a sign of potential future for reconciliation. So it seems to me, in conclusion, that the best hope for long-term peace following the remarkable defeat of the Tamil Tigers in Elam 4 lies in robust political and economic reform at the local community level in all the former insurgent-controlled areas. I think you know this, and I think it's an opportunity now for Sri Lanka to show the world not only how to defeat a ruthless terrorist enemy as you've done with the Tamil Tigers, but how to make peace afterwards, to be just as proficient and to show the way just as clearly in reconciliation, reintegration, and building a just and sustainable peace as you've already shown in the military operations. A government that brings peace, justice and reconciliation to its people will be defended by all of its people, regardless of their ethnic group. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. I haven't shied away from raising some difficult political questions, and I hope you'll understand the importance that I certainly see is attached to engaging openly with international criticism, while in no way minimizing Sri Lanka's achievement in destroying such a violent and ruthless group as the Tamil Tigers. The importance of seeking lasting peace through justice couldn't be more important at this point. I look forward to learning more from you both during the conference and later this week and into the weekend in the field. Thank you.